tale of two parties. Brazilians get set to vote in a wildly uncertain race for president. One candidate accused of misogyny, while the other party's de facto leader is in jail. I'm Imran Garta, and today's newsmaker is Brazil's election. The rise of far-right Congressman Jair Bolsonaro began with a promise to bring change to a country dogged by one corruption scandal after another. Bolsonaro's popularity surged after he survived an assassination attempt. But this week, the chants of support turned into cries of "Ele não," Portuguese for "not him." Tens of thousands of women have taken to the streets in protest, upset over the frontrunner who once told a congresswoman she wasn't worthy of being raped. So, while Brazil has been fractured over the jailing of ministers and former President Lula da Silva, are we also seeing a culture war leading into Sunday's presidential vote? Sandra Gutman has this report from Rio de Janeiro.
Eu sou patinho feio nessa história, mas que tenho certeza, seremos punidos brevemente.
The thing about Jair Bolsonaro is that it's difficult to sum him up or explain his rise from far-right firebrand to Brazil's presidential frontrunner. So let's start with his supporters. Bikers love him.
Queremos lei, queremos justiça, por isso que nós apoiamos o amigo Bolsonaro, que inclusive também é motociclista. Um grande número que está aqui também são militares que não aceitam esse tipo de governo do passado.
Ele simplesmente deu voz a um segmento muito grande da população que acredita na família, que acredita em valores, que acredita no trabalho. Você pega, olha o que o socialismo fez, por exemplo, na Venezuela.
Você deve votar em Bolsonaro para presidente da nossa nação.
He's also the favorite among Brazil's base of evangelical Christians.
Ele é a favor da vida. Ele é a favor dos valores de família. Ele é contra essa bandidagem de erotizar criança em escola que toda a esquerda quer.
And then there are the unlikely fans.
Meu nome é Cleiton César Sobral. Eu sou negro, sou pobre, sou jovem. Eu teria todo o potencial para apoiar o PT, apoiar o governo deles. Mas eles roubaram tanto o Brasil e a direita está se bandeando para esse fato. Esse candidato, Bolsonaro, ele me interessou, ele abriu os meus olhos para a política. Me deu, total segurança de que ele vai realmente mudar. Porque ele não é igual aos outros políticos que falam o que as pessoas querem ouvir.
Eu sou estuprador agora. Olha, jamais estuprar você que você não merece.
Vamos fuzilar a petralhada aqui do Acre, hein?
Empregaria com meu salário. Agora tem muita mulher que é competente. Eu acho que essa é igual.
Tem muita mulher que é competente.
Muito mais competente.
Bolsonaro has made many enemies. He's faced charges for hate speech, and last month he was stabbed at a rally. But even as he recovered in hospital, his poll numbers kept climbing.
Boa tarde a todos.
Brasil acima de tudo! Deus acima de tudo!
Meanwhile, his sons have been on the campaign trail.
Much of the world is worried about your father as a candidate and the messages that he is spreading. They say he's a racist candidate, xenophobic. What do you say to that?
Don't worry about Bolsonaro. We are here to rescue Brazil to be great again against every wrong things that are happening in our country. And we are here to bring everybody hope. That's what we do. We will rescue Brazil from the corruption.
Years of rampant corruption, an enduring recession, and soaring crime rates have a simple solution under Bolsonaro: his all-encompassing policy is more law and order. But there is serious concern about what that might look like.
Eu quero uma polícia civil e militar que, em defesa do povo, atire para matar.
In Rio's favelas, there are more guns on the streets than ever. This year, the government stepped up military and police raids.
Crime and gang violence are serious problems here. But residents also feel that a growing police presence on the streets is actually making life more dangerous.
A intervenção que botaram, assim, eu não estou vendo trazer nada de bom no momento. Cada vez mais eu só estou vendo mais violência, entendeu? E assim, está sendo uma coisa muito difícil, porque essa violência está vindo através dos policiais, né? E se torna mais difícil ainda quando se encontra pela esquina uma pessoa de cor. Se torna uma coisa muito difícil, porque às vezes as nossas crianças estão brincando e começa um tiroteio. Já coisa de uns mesezinho, houve uma troca de tiro e acidentemente minha filha foi no fundo de casa e encontrou um cadáver.
Human rights defenders say fighting violence with violence is a failed policy.
Praticamente a cada 4 pessoas mortas, civis mortos, uma é morto pelo Estado. Uma figura como Bolsonaro legitima ou valoriza ou se aproveita dessa percepção da população de medo, de insegurança, de temor e de crença de que é preciso uma resposta dura, de ordem, e que a gente tem visto historicamente que esses resultados são muito mais danosos aos direitos, danosos à população e especialmente à população mais pobre, do que produzem resultados positivos.
Brazil's young democracy is facing a test. 30 years after the fall of the country's military dictatorship, Bolsonaro has openly praised the old days. His supporters say it's the medicine this country needs. His critics warn that history is too easily forgotten. Sandra Gatman, The Newsmakers, Rio de Janeiro, Brazil.
Well, joining me now from Boston, we have Julio Moraes. He organized Bolsonaro's U.S. tour last year and is also founder of the Public Administration Institute. In New York, we have Natalia de Campos, who's the co-founder of the liberal organization Defend Democracy in Brazil. And in London, Anthony Pereira, the director of the Brazil Institute at King's College London. I thank you all for joining us here on the Newsmakers. I want to understand the magic or the secret behind Bolsonaro. As a supporter, Julio Moraes, tell me what's so special about him and why you think he's going to be the next president.
Well, thanks for the opportunity to be in your show. What I believe Bolsonaro will bring to Brazil right now is change. We'll bring back the values and patriotism. That's what we need right now. Brazil's situation for the last couple of years being like decreasing. So we need to move forward. We need to bring back the patriotism so people can be proud to be Brazilian again.
So you say values, right? But for many, especially those tens of thousands who had taken to the streets recently, those values consist of sexism, misogyny, and homophobia. Would you agree with that?
No, that's how the left side wants to label Bolsonaro. But if you take in and check his history, his background, you're gonna see it's totally different. They said that he's a racist. He's not. His father-in-law is black. They say he don't like women. He makes some comments, but Lula also makes some comments too regarding women. But when Bolsonaro says something, they change stuff when he said. But like when someone else said, they just agree. So I don't agree with the way the opposite party tried to label Bolsonaro.
Okay, let me bring in Natalia de Campos. Natalia, you sit there. We see you on camera. You've got a free Lula badge on you there, on your lapel. Tell me why you disagree with Julio Moraes.
I think we've been doing work for the last 3 years to show what's really happening in Brazil outside of the mainstream media. one of the things that the mainstream media does is also incite or bring up Bolsonaro's, like very simplified views of the women and rights and racism, homophobia. And it's very important to note, and responding to what Julio said, is that he has made remarks inside the Congress to one of his colleagues, right? And he's been persecuted for that, and he's been found guilty for inciting violence against women, rape, inciting the fact that she, the particular representative we're talking about is the person who was told, he told her that she shouldn't be even raped for being so ugly. So he was persecuted and found guilty for that. I think it's very important to think of the overall movement that has come out of that. Just on Facebook or social media, more than 4 million women banded together.
Right. So Natalia,
against these values that he proclaims.
That's interesting, and you say that, right? And now let me take that a step further. This man is pretty disgusting in your eyes, right? But not in the eyes of millions of Brazilians who quite likely would put him into the seat of power. So if these polls are to be believed, we're going to have a first round, and after the first round, it's going to go to a runoff between right and left, Bolsonaro versus Haddad. And according to the Estado de São Paulo newspaper and TV Globo, according to their polls, many Brazilians, tens of millions of Brazilians disagree with you. They want to make him the president. How do you feel about that, Natalia?
Well, I think there's a lot of misinformation going around as well. One of the things about the media in Brazil, of course, is very controlled by 5 powerful families. And so these polls are run by these families as well. They are hired by the families. So there are very different results between the Vox Populi, which is another more popular funded voting poll company, and then the ones sponsored by Globo or Estado de São Paulo. So the numbers are very differing, and we're going to be seeing new polls on Saturday.
Okay.
I think.
Okay. So you're hanging a question mark over the polls.
Question,
right. Go ahead.
He is very much like Trump. In the sense that he uses the media and tries to manipulate the image, but what he's saying is really empty promises. Some of the things are already guaranteed by the Constitution, such as some promises on, say, public safety, and also some assets, some things of the economy that he wants to make prevail. And those are already guaranteed by the Constitution. So he's not really bringing anything new, as Julio says.
Right. Natalia, you say he's very much like Trump. With him being very much like Trump, it's worth remembering that Trump won, right? So again, I wonder just how much you fear him winning. We'll come back to you in a moment. I want to bring in Anthony Pereira. Anthony Pereira, tell me what this election means for the country. How much of an example is it of the political polarization in Brazil right now, especially with the rise of someone like Bolsonaro?
Well, I think it is an example of polarization, and it breaks the mold of previous elections in Brazil. If you look at the last 6 presidential elections, 5 of them had a second round, and in all 5 of those second rounds, you had a center-left candidate from the PT, from the Workers' Party, and you had a center-right candidate from the PSDB, the Social Democratic Party. This time, it looks very, very probable that there'll be a second round with a hard-right candidate, Bolsonaro, and a center-left candidate, Fernando Haddad of the Workers' Party. So the choice is extremely consequential this time. The gap between the candidates is very wide, and I think not all the elements of the Bolsonaro platform are well known. I mean, there's a big piece with Paulo Guedes, the economic advisor to Bolsonaro, and it's a very liberal economic policy. It's far more liberal than we've seen in recent years from a major candidate in Brazil. So I think this is a very consequential election with a very clear, a very stark choice for the Brazilian electorate.
Julio Moraes, are you comfortable being considered far-right?
Yes, kind of. I think for Brazil right now, the situation we are right now, I think Bolsonaro is the right guy because he's going to fix the country. I think Brazil lost the values. We lost what it's called the family values right now. We have Lula backing up people like Hugo Chavez, Maduro, and we see what's going on in Venezuela right now. You know what I'm saying? Like, we don't want to go towards to that way. I think Bolsonaro will bring those values back, which is important for the Brazilian population. But he also, what he's doing right now, he's the candidate that not using public money to make campaign. He already set up all the cabinet, and he doesn't have to wait for the second round to appoint it. What actually other candidate gonna do it? What they usually do, like this, they kind of like sell the cabinet for other parties in exchange to the support for the second round. And Bolsonaro doing something different. Okay. It's the people going on the street. It's the people doing the campaign for Bolsonaro. It's not like public money involved. Right.
Anthony Pereira, is Bolsonaro cleaner than the left, and that's why people are choosing the right-wing candidate? Is that a fair argument?
Well, there are some allegations about him hiding money offshore. I mean, I think we don't know. He's been a kind of baixo clero. He's been a fairly marginal member of the lower house. So I don't think we really know whether there'd be corruption in his government. I mean, one of the things that I think is also an issue here is how either of these two front-running candidates, how either Haddad or Bolsonaro could govern given the degree of polarization. And I think one thing that's interesting that hasn't come up yet is that the polls, I know Natalia was questioning some of the polls, but several of the polls show a very big gender gap in the intentions of the voters, 15–16% gender gap between men and women. So whether Julio's right about Bolsonaro's positions, it does seem that he has a lot less support from women than from men, and the women's vote could then be could tip the balance in this second round.
And is that how
that's something that's gotten a lot of attention, I think.
That's interesting, because Natalia, is that one of the messages that you have for people, is that if you are a woman, this man is bad for you?
Well, that is one of the main messages, and it's not the only one. I think we're very concerned about LGBTQ and the communities of color in Brazil, the indigenous, because he has also made declarations. But I want to just also to contrast, you know, what Anthony said earlier about being what the media is pushing for in Brazil right now is that there's two extremes, and that's not really true. So let's start by that. So that the Bolsonaro will be the extreme right and the Haddad will be the extreme left, and that's just not the case. I mean, the 12 years of PT, or the Workers' Party, in power have shown that it's a real social democrat government, and it has pushed a lot of social advancements. So I wanted to talk a little bit about Haddad and what he would bring in contrast, right, to Bolsonaro, because I think he would be more concerned with all the rights of these communities I mentioned. He also would be with the economic development that is sustainable and not just what, so since Dilma Rousseff was removed from power illegally, right, the illegitimate government, which we call illegitimate because he just, her vice president just turned over the policies for which her government was elected, right, and then started to implement all this liberal, also very neoliberal changes. And so the ultra-liberal policies of Paulo Guedes, who might be the Minister of Economy under Bolsonaro's government, is very concerning to us as well. It's not just about the small communities or the activist communities, right, of the women, but I think women know well what the economy is, what is needed for the economy to run, and they have been very vocal about, we don't want this person because of what he says about us, because he's promoting liberal policies that are going to be detrimental to these communities, and they're also going to be for the growth, for the sustainable growth, at least, of Brazil in general. I think it's very important to note that we're not going to be able to sustain Michel Temer's policies, and so the Workers' Party is really engaged into turning them around, right, and reestablishing the growth that was possible for the last 12 years. I mean, the 12 years prior to his government.
Okay, so Julio, you heard both sides there. You heard why Natalia is against Bolsonaro, but also why she's for Haddad. Are you convinced by any of that?
No, and I respectfully disagree with Natalia. Let's say Haddad, vice president candidate, she's a member of the Communist Party of Brazil. So it shows like the extreme left side of this campaign. I also agree on some point we have a growth in the Brazilian economy while Lula was president, but we also have this situation right now. And let's be honest, PT has been in power for 13 years, right? Michel Temer was a vice president for Dilma, so who else voted for Dilma, vote for him. If he changed policy, which I don't think was the reason of the economic chaos we having right now, because that started like right after the second campaign, the second election for Dilma in 2014. So I agree if Lula deserved the credit, if the Works Party deserve the credit for the economic growth, but they also deserve the credit for the economic chaos that Brazil is right now. And the policy, it's simple. If we see something not doing right, we should change. And why keep voting for someone that continues to putting the same policy in place, right? And when we see like the economic growth going to a different
Although
way.
what is interesting is that she's against Temer's policies as well. However, I want to go to Anthony Pereira here. Before we say goodbye to you, Anthony, besides presidential elections, Brazilians are choosing state governors, senators, etc. In a nutshell, help us understand, as an international audience, we don't know much about Brazil and we don't know much about how much is at stake. Help us understand, how much is at stake in this election?
Well, a lot's at stake because whoever gets elected president is not going to have a majority of their own party in either of the two houses. Where there could be a high rate of renovation. I mean, maybe 40% perhaps of the people in Congress, a lot of the leaders could get reelected. That means however much either candidate wants to change things, they'll have to work with a Congress. And that's why there's talk in the air of about a constituent assembly to change the rules of the system. So it's not going to be easy for anybody to govern Brazil after this election. And there's some really difficult choices. The pension system is, in deficit. The overall government deficit represents about 7% of GDP. So there's a government going to have a real fiscal straitjacket, going to have to make very, very difficult choices. So, as you say, people are voting for governors, they're voting for state assemblies, they're voting for the lower house, they're voting for some of the Senate seats. The ability of these candidates to form coalitions and rule is going to really be tested after this election.
Yeah, certainly. Almost 150 million voters expected to vote on Sunday. It's just a reminder of what a massive country Brazil is and just how important this is. It's a chaotic and fascinating democracy. We're going to take a short break, and thank you, Anthony Pereira. Natalia and Julio, stay where you are. Thanks, Anthony, for joining us on the Newsmakers. We'll be back just after this break. After the break, we put Brazil's liberal candidates under the microscope. Can the left overcome the impeachment of one leader and the jailing of another? Brazil's election on Sunday might very well mark the final chapter in Lula da Silva's tragic political career. A factory worker who would become president in 2002, Lula brought his country out of debt and transformed the nation into a major player on the global stage. But a vast corruption scandal landed him and several of his ministers in jail and led to the impeachment of his protege, President Dilma Rousseff. Now it's up to former São Paulo Mayor Fernando Haddad to keep his Workers' Party in power. But Haddad, who's currently running second in the polls, will have to win while facing his own corruption charges. Once again, here's Sandra Gatman, who filed this report from the city of Salvador.
In Salvador's streets, there's nostalgia for an icon. But I'm not talking about Michael Jackson.
Tudo Lula.
Lula livre?
Tudo.
Lula livre. Lula foi o governo que mais olhou pelos pobres, fez a política nacional de salário mínimo, construiu mais estradas, mais hospitais.
Tudo isso.
This colonial port city was once a gateway for millions of African slaves. Today, it's the heart of a proud Afro-Brazilian community whose rights were championed by former Brazilian President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva and his Workers' Party. This long-neglected region now has better transport links and electricity. And social programs that lifted millions out of poverty still shelter the most vulnerable.
Nath gosta de brincar de boneca? Você gosta de brincar de boneca?
Acho que o Brasil, o salário mínimo está muito reduzido ainda. Não supre as nossas necessidades, principalmente com filho com deficiência.
Patricia has just moved in to one of Bahia's newest public housing blocks. She benefits from a financing scheme created by Lula to help low-income families buy property.
Para mim foi muito bom, muito gratificante mesmo. Principalmente por ela, porque eu morava numa casa muito pequena, que era cedida. Então, assim, para ela que é cadeirante, não tinha mobilidade nenhuma na casa. Quem que não quer, né, uma casa sua, né?
If Lula were to run for president today, all the polls say he'd win. But a 12-year jail sentence for alleged corruption has banned him from the race. And so, just weeks before this crucial election, Lula was forced to handpick his successor.
Quero pedir de coração a todos que votariam em mim, que votem no companheiro Fernando Haddad para presidente da República.
Nós vamos ganhar essa eleição pelo Lula, pelo PT, pelo PCdoB, pelos movimentos sociais e pelo Brasil.
He was not the first choice. Haddad is the more moderate wing of the Workers' Party. He's a philosophy professor of the University of São Paulo, a scholar, a former Minister of Education, a former Mayor of São Paulo. The big challenge that Haddad faces, not only in the Northeast, but in the rest of Brazil, is to present himself to voters as the political heir of former President Lula. Because many people don't know Haddad, especially outside the state of São Paulo.
Mas Lula está pedindo que a gente vote em Haddad como seu representante. Haddad é esse.
E vem cá, será que ele vai andar certo igual como o Lula andou?
Sim, vai.
Lula's party has another obstacle. The so-called Lava Jato, or car wash investigations into corruption, ignited a public reckoning against all political parties, even the Workers' Party here in Bahia.
Sinceramente, eu sou Lula. Eu tenho dúvida porque são todos iguais. Quando entrou, se corrompeu.
Antes eu votei pro PT. Mas agora, depois das fraudes todas que eu fiquei sabendo, de Lula e tudo, de Dilma, e aí agora eu estou muito confusa.
Even Patricia isn't so sure.
¿Y va a votar para el PT en estas elecciones?
Não sei ainda.
¿Tiene confianza en los políticos?
Não, nenhuma. Nenhuma. Eu parei de votar tem muito tempo. Quer dizer, eu vou porque eu sou obrigada, mas eu voto nulo em todos os candidatos.
Workers' Party officials know they have an image problem, but they say they're being targeted by political rivals who want to keep the left out of power.
E que se tiver corrupto no PT, tem que ser preso, condenado e pagar por isso. Então, não estamos aqui querendo fazer uma defesa simples. Cometemos erro? Cometemos. A questão de utilizar recursos em campanhas, nós somos a favor da apuração e investigação, agora com juízes imparciais, não como esse juiz aí direcionado, servindo a interesse de partidos políticos.
Haddad has one more weapon, growing rejection of his top right-wing rival, Jair Bolsonaro. The presidential candidate's derogatory remarks about women, gays, and minorities have repulsed many on the left and beyond.
He don't like women, and I don't like him. Not him. No way.
He's a sick person. We cannot stand this person.
If the two come face to face in a final round, polls say Haddad could win. A victory for the Workers' Party would be cheered by the old left, who want to pick up where Lula left off. The so-called pink tide some thought Brazil had buried may well return. Sandra Gatman, The Newsmakers, Salvador, Brazil.
Well, joining me now in Sao Paulo is Lula da Silva's lawyer, Valeska Martins. Valeska, good to have you on The Newsmakers once again. Do you regret that Lula wasn't in this presidential race?
Absolutely. He was arbitrarily removed, even though there has been a interim measure from the United Nations Human Rights Committee demanding Brazil to not remove him from the race. I think not only Lula's rights has been taken away from him, but also the entire Brazilian population's right to choose who to vote for, who should run the country.
Even if the UN comes back and finds some sort of mechanism in order to get the Brazilian courts to look at things differently and he's out of jail, by that time, Bolsonaro could be your president. How do you feel about that?
Well, I think Brazil has to comply with its international obligations in good faith. It means that by the fact that it ratified in 2009 an optional protocol accepting the United Nations Human Rights Committee's jurisdiction, I think it should comply with its decision anytime, in any manner possible.
Looking at who is running instead at the head of the party, Mr. Haddad, does Lula have complete faith in him leading the way?
Well, Lula made a choice. He was forced into he was forced into complying with the electoral court's electoral court's decision. He trusts Haddad, of course, will substitute him and will lead the way and implement Lula's program. However, Lula understands that he was arbitrarily removed from the race, and it should be him standing for the presidential elections.
And for those who look at it from the outside in, and I understand that you're not a politician, but obviously these things overlap, Valeska, and I appreciate you always taking the time to discuss these things with us. For those who say, well, Lula's in jail, Dilma was impeached, and a far-right leader could be the next president, isn't it time for Lula and his entire team and the entire left to take a moment for some self-reflection rather than continuing to blame the system for being against them?
Well, as you said, it's all intertwined. It's not blaming the system to be against him, but it's a matter of fact. We are his attorneys, and I can tell you that he was convicted of undetermined acts. So if that's not justice, that is a political persecution. And in terms of whether the left should unite and do what we call a mea culpa, I think that should be left for the politicians. But we do believe that anyone who comes into power should uphold the rule of law, democratic principles, because we've been through a dictatorship not long ago, and we've achieved a lot in terms of individual rights, social rights. We cannot go back at this point. We cannot go back to pre-World War II standards of human rights. And this is what we fight for, not only in Brazil, before the judicial system in Brazil, but also before the United Nations Human Rights Committee.
And very finally, for absolute clarity, who has politically persecuted Lula da Silva?
Well, this is something that we've always been repeating. The car wash operation started as investigating a corruption scandal, but it turned into a political persecution against Lula. When they filed baseless accusations, baseless, meritless accusations against President Lula, when they imprisoned him arbitrarily against what our Constitution says, against any evidence, against any crime, for undetermined acts, for something he never owned or possessed. They keep him, they removed him most arbitrarily from the presidential elections, and now they don't even want him to give interviews. So we are talking about numerous violations of human rights, numerous violations, including of free speech and of free press. So the parts of the judiciary in Brazil, especially the car wash operation and the judge in front of the car wash operation, they have been politically persecuting Lula and not prosecuting him criminally.
And ahead of the elections, do you think that those behind his political persecution, as you call it, have a preferred candidate in this election?
Well, I think that what we've been witnessing for the past few days is I would say, a meddling with the elections. The fact that Lula has been forbidden to give interviews against what the Constitution says, against what the law provides for, that would be, in a way, favoring one candidate against the other. And this is something that we cannot have. This is not an ideologist sentence, a phrase. This is something that all Brazilians should have. If you're right-wing, if you're left-wing, all human rights, all rights should be upheld, not only in Brazil, but internationally as well. So I think meddling with the elections by the judiciary should not be taken lightly by the population.
Valeska Martins, thanks so much for joining us once again on the Newsmakers. Let's open up this discussion to our panel now. In London, we're joined by Peter Collicott, a former British ambassador to Brazil. And still with us in Boston is Julio Moraes. He's the founder of the Public Administration Institute and the organizer of Bolsonaro's US tour in 2017. And in New York, Natalia de Campos, the co-founder of the liberal organization Defend Democracy in Brazil. Peter Collicott, you would have heard what Valeska Martins, Lula da Silva's lawyer, said to me. Are we seeing a form of political persecution of the left? Or rather, is it the other way around, that the left just messed this whole thing up?
Well, I don't believe in the theories that people have that this is a political persecution, just as I don't believe those who say that removing President Dilma Rousseff from power was a coup d'état, if you like. You can argue about the details of the legality or the seriousness of the offences for which he was removed from power, but I think it was all done perfectly constitutionally. Equally, it seems to me that the judicial processes which have been carried out against Lula and against other politicians and businessmen have been carried out with a certain amount of, what can one say, certain amount of panache and publicity, which is not necessarily normal in Brazil. But they seem to me, and I think the other courts agree with this, to have been carried out according to the laws and procedures of the country.
That's interesting. You say panache and publicity. Some would say a lot of enthusiasm from a lot of prosecutors and judges, and that's one of the points that they argue. Natalia de Campos, ahead of this election, it is clear that Lula's legal troubles have hurt the Workers' Party. That's undoubted. We have Haddad, who's not as charismatic as Lula da Silva. He cannot draw a crowd like Lula da Silva. Are you supporting, you may not like it, but are you having to support an inferior leader as your candidate?
I think there are several parts of this answer. I'd like to also address the ambassador, and thank you for participating in the discussion, Ambassador. I think it's very, the perception of the legality is very misused right now in Brazil, because there is a supposed constitutional base for everything that's happening. But in reality, I think they are trampling, even the Supreme Court has been trampling a lot of the Constitution. One of the examples, the very clear examples, because we as an activist group in New York and others like us in other cities of the world that have been fighting since 2016 for the return of democracy, I think are very clear that there is a collusion between the judiciary, the legislative, and the executive powers in Brazil, which is kind of like also countering democracy, right? Mixing up the powers that should be separate. So one of the things is that, for example, in the last week, concrete facts. So very often, I say this because very often we are so said to be excuse me, we are said to be of the people who are saying that there is some sort of plan to destroy democracy. And it's not just not based in facts what we say. Like we can see in the last week that the Supreme Court justices have been contradicting each other whether Lula can give an interview or not. They're very afraid what he can say in favor of Haddad because he's a very, very strong political power worldwide, recognized worldwide in Africa, in the United States, in Europe, right? So just to finish up my answer, I would like to say that, yes, I support Haddad because, well, first, he also was a mayor to São Paulo, where I'm from, which is a completely chaotic city. And he has been able to advance a lot of programs that brought more stability to the city, transportation, and social programs to support populations that are most at risk.
But truth be told, he's not Lula. And is that going to ultimately hurt you in this election,
right.
Natalia?
Well, I think if it were Lula running, we know that maybe there wouldn't even be a second round of elections, right, the runoff. So I think there is a fight to be fought, and I think there is a lot of support that he gained, and also getting the word in such a short amount of time that Haddad is the chosen candidate instead of Lula is a big challenge. But I think there is a lot of, he also was a minister of education, we have to remember, for almost 12 years. So he did a lot of, a little less than 12 years before he had to step out to run for mayor. But he was able to advance the ProUni, or he presented the program and advanced, which brought 2 million young people to universities in Brazil, which is like unheard of before. Since colonial times, like we have never had that in the history of Brazil, many of which have never ever had access or are first generation in universities.
So, Julio.
So I think there is a good chance that people are paying attention.
Okay, people are paying attention. But Julio, you guys must have been breathing a sigh of relief when you realized that you were up against Haddad and not Lula, because Operation Car Wash gave you on the right a great victory. You were up against initially Lionel Messi, and now Haddad, I don't know, maybe he's a second division player, but he's clearly not Lula. How important was it to you guys that you were not coming up against Lula?
I think the fact is not the fact that Lula is not running, but justice being made. Lula is arrested. He was sent in the first in a low court. He got sent in a low court. He appealed. He got sentenced and got 4 more years. And then he appealed to the Supreme Court, which the majority being appointed by him or Dilma herself. And they agree he should be arrested. So the corruption charge on his name is true, and the fact that the justice has to be for all, not just for for the low people.
But Julio, if you'll allow me to come in here, Julio, I've read a couple of quotes which seem to suggest that Bolsonaro admired the military dictatorship of decades gone by. So when it comes to justice, how can we expect justice from Bolsonaro? The man was admiring undemocratic, unjust military dictatorship.
Well, he admired the growth, the economic growth the military government brought. But let's think about this. During the military era in Brazil, there was not such violence that we deal right now. The economic growth was going up, and education in Brazil was improving.
But my point was justice.
Too.
There was no justice. It was a military dictatorship. People were disappeared at night from their homes. So if you're saying Lula is in jail because of justice, no more, no less, I'm saying Bolsonaro supported a very unjust military dictatorship. It wasn't about the economy.
But think about this. The people that disappeared doing something wrong was doing something wrong. Let's go back to Dilma. She got arrested during this time. She was tortured or something like that. I'm totally against the torture. But the thing is, she was robbing banks. She was bringing violence. Those are the people that served with the military era.
Let me bring in Peter Collicott here. Peter Collicott, I asked this question of Anthony Pereira earlier on, and I'm going to ask this of you right now. How much does this current election tell us about how polarized and divided the country is right now? What does this say about Brazil in 2018?
Well, I suspect that Anthony will have given you roughly the same kind of answer that I do. I think it actually says that Brazil is very polarized. It's not unique in Brazil. We're polarized in this country. We know in various other countries around the world, politics and the economic situation have contrived to make the traditional parties very weak and to prejudice or to bring forward the extremes of left and right in a rather polarized way. But I think what is also true is that for the last 4 or 5 years, we have seen social unrest and social cynicism about the whole political process in Brazil, which we haven't seen for many years. And this is obviously, over those years, been fed by some inefficiencies in government, by a bad economic situation, and by this whole corruption scandal. And perhaps an unfortunate but inevitable consequences of that is a polarization of the political process. But what I think one could say about that is that it's very sad for Brazil, but it's also rather sad that this election, which we're talking about, has not become a time for resolution, a time of, if you like, catharsis, when new politicians, perhaps from a younger generation, have come through to say there is a brighter future and let's see if we can get there.
And Mr. Ambassador, do you expect it to swing to the right after Sunday? Or after a second round at least?
Well, I think after the second round, it's very difficult to judge. I think, you know, if one believes the polls, then Mr. Bolsonaro will win in the first round, and Fernando Haddad will come second until they will run off. I think it's very much more difficult to predict what will happen in the second round. I've seen various polls suggesting that either of them could win. And if one analyzes it, I think there is likely to be quite a swing of votes from the other candidates who don't get into the second round to support Mr. Haddad, rather than see Mr. Bolsonaro become the president, because I think there's quite a strong feeling against that, a negative feeling against him.
Julia, would you accept a Haddad victory? Because your candidate has in the past said, well, if I lose, it will be rigged, and then he sort of walked that back. Just for clarity, would you accept a Haddad victory?
Yes, I will, because it's part of democracy. Thinking different than the Works Party, that's democracy, so I will accept that. But let me be honest with you. I support Lula in the second election and Dilma in the first election. I think, like myself, many Brazilians changed the point of view and the voters because they see we're going to the wrong side. So, to be honest with you, I'm nothing against Lula. I think he did a good job in the first term, but I think he should be credited for the cause that we have in Brazil right now.
Natalia de Campos, what's your message to those Brazilians who want to have some change, who want to give the other side a fresh chance? They feel the Workers' Party has bungled this. Maybe there were some injustices, maybe everybody was corrupt, and maybe the legal system just picked on Dilma and picked on Lula, but they want a fresh start and they want to give Bolsonaro a go. They want to try something new. What's your message to them?
Well, I would also pick up at the point that I think Haddad and his vice president, Manuela Dávila, they do represent change. And the reason for that is that, one, they're a younger generation, of course, than the politicians that have been in power for a long time. They have carried programs or legislation, like Manuela as in the House of Representatives, that are progressive. And I would also like to just mention that we are not a liberal group, but we're a progressive group, or more aligned with progressive policies. I think that's why we align. But also would like to say that we represent also a very plural number of people. So I'm not just, I am specifically voting for Haddad and clearly declaring so, but we have people who are progressives who are not necessarily voting for Haddad. That doesn't mean that they won't vote for him in the second round, right? Because I think it's a very clear distinction between water and fire, Bolsonaro and Haddad, that Haddad will continue some policies that worked out. He will create new ones and bring change with Manuela, who's a very fresh, new light. And the Communist Party is far from extreme left as well, as it was mentioned before. Okay. So I think they have the potential to bring a lot of new policies.
Okay, it's been great talking to all of you. Lots of speculation, lots of what ifs. We'll find out after Sunday, I guess, and I hope to get all of you back on the program at some point. It's been a pleasure talking to all of you. Natalia de Campos, Ambassador Peter Collicott, and Julio Moraes.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining us on the Newsmakers.
Pleasure's mine.
That's all for this edition of the Newsmakers with me, Imran Garda. You can check out more of our stories on YouTube, Facebook and Twitter. Remember to like, follow and subscribe. Next time, our special coverage from Ethiopia continues as we look at the historic peace deal with Eritrea. Until then, thank you for watching. Bye-bye.